The morning began with coffee and death. Perhaps if it hadn't been for the coffee, nothing would have gone wrong. But the coffee was there. I made it myself. At the coffee shop where I work as a barista, I brewed it with love. I enjoyed its aroma, and I decorated it with a heart on the milk foam. I made it for the man with whom I'd spent an unforgettable first night. We met here at this coffee shop, Gemini. Eric was our regular customer, and he loved to work with a cup of coffee. The renowned Eric Dupay. All the global media fought for the 33-year-old photographer's works. He loved my coffee in particular. That morning, I wanted to bring it to him in bed. There was nobody in the coffee shop. My partner, Frida, was running late. Derek, our janitor, wasn't there either. These two had an affair, but Frida seemed to be avoiding her boyfriend recently. Finally, the chimes over the door jingled. Derek stumbled inside and stared at me with blurry eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept last night. I didn't have time for a chat, so having announced I was taking a day off, I sneaked outside. I didn't feel the ground beneath my feet all the way along the block towards Eric's. It seemed I could soar up to the 15th floor on which he lived. However, as soon as I approached the building, I saw that there was no need to do it. A crowd of police officers and passers-by who were filming something with their phones gathered there. I stepped up to the yellow tape with which the police fenced off a square piece of land. In the middle of it lied Eric's body. It wasn't him, though, but the gown with wings on its back that I recognized. The cup slipped out of my hand, and I felt the smell of the damned coffee. I felt dizzy, and my throat felt hoarse with sickness. Somebody grabbed me by the arm and snatched me out of the throng. It was Frida. Her lips were moving, but I couldn't get a single word she was saying. She helped me wash my face with water from her bottle and took me to the coffee shop. It took me several hours to pull myself together. I cried on Derek's shoulder, and he was weeping with me. This huge man, who recently turned 35, remained a susceptible child in his soul. Frida was serving the customers and was the only one among us who kept calm. This was until the police came to the coffee shop. The young investigator asked Frida a few questions about Eric, and then she showed her 2 still shots from the CCTV camera next to his place. The first had been taken a few days earlier, while the second one was from the previous night. The neighbors claimed to have recognized Eric and the barista from Gemini in them. Frida drummed her fingers on the bar nervously, but she denied it was her in the pictures. I wedged into the conversation and confessed that I had been with Eric from yesterday's night to this morning. I said it was me in the photo, at least in one of them, though I didn't mention the latter fact. The investigator looked from me to Frida. We both had our hair made similarly, and it was the same color. Besides, our clothing, according to the corporate dress code, was also identical, which is why people often thought we were twins. I didn't know how I could help the police. There had been nothing suspicious about Eric's behavior. During our date, he hadn't spoken to anybody else or planned any meetings. The investigator asked me about Eric's mood when I left, and I froze. Did she mean the date with me was so terrible that the man decided to jump from the 15th floor? I imagined the yellow press headlines with my photo. The investigator explained they hadn't found traces of struggle or robbery in the apartment. Therefore, they were checking the version that the victim could have had psychological problems. Before leaving, the investigator checked our cameras to note down the time that I'd spent at the coffee shop. After that, she left her card in case I recalled something else. There was no use of me at the coffee shop. The smell of coffee made me sick. So I went home. I tried to sort out what had happened. I sifted through the memories, but couldn't get hold of any one of them. Then I concentrated on Frida. Why didn't my friend confess that she was in one of the photos? Was it possible that she'd had an affair with Eric? Could it be the reason her relationship with Derek worsened? And I also wondered what she was doing at the site of the tragedy. After all, she lived on the opposite end of the city. So I called her to find answers to my questions. Before answering, Frida asked me to wait until she found somewhere where nobody could hear her, and then she confessed that she was several weeks pregnant. No, not from Eric. How could I even think of it? The baby was Derek's, but he didn't know yet. Frida hesitated about whether she should keep the baby, and while she was thinking, she decided to put her relationship with him on hold. A few days ago, she'd seen Eric to borrow the money for the abortion. This was why she was in the photo. In the end, she decided she would give birth, which is why she'd been on her way to Eric's to repay the debt. But she'd seen the same scene as I had. I thought Frida's story was sincere. The next day at the coffee shop, my friend told me the great news. After our conversation, she told Derek she was pregnant. Later that day, he arranged them a date and proposed to her. I was happy for my friend, and I embraced her. But then I smelled her fragrance, which made me shudder. It was the same perfume with coffee notes that Eric had used. I parted from Frida and complimented her fragrance. She smiled and said she'd pass it on to Derek, as it was his new perfume. It took me by surprise. I doubted an ordinary janitor could afford things that a successful photographer could buy. However, it was possible that Derek used a cheap copy instead of the original perfume. I dialed the investigator and asked her to take me to inspect Eric's apartment. Above all, I was looking for the perfume, the fragrance of which I remembered so well. However, the shelf on which I'd seen it last time was empty. Another thing that disappeared from the shelf was his handmade wooden airplane. Eric had told me it was the only thing that he had left from his parents. The investigator frowned and opened her folder with the papers. According to the records, the photographer's parents still lived. They were well and had a good relationship with their son. Could I have probably misunderstood Eric's words? I thought I could, but just in case, I sneak peeked in the investigator's papers, remembering Eric's parents' address. I wasn't sure they'd want to speak to me, but I had to try. Mr. and Mrs. Dupay lived in a cozy 2-story house in the nearest suburb. I was lucky to find them home when I arrived. When they heard I was Eric's friend, they invited me in. We talked for a few hours about their son before I found the courage to ask about the toy plane. Eric's parents exchanged glances and nodded to each other, as if agreeing on something. And then they shared a big family secret that they had told nobody except their son. Eric had been adopted. The Dupays met him when the boy was 3. It was at an orphanage in a little remote European town of which I never heard. His mother died giving him birth. His father died soon afterward, and the only thing he left for his son was the airplane he'd made himself. Eric knew that, so he treated the toy with great care, believing it brought him luck. Once, in an interview, Eric mentioned his mascot and even allowed the publication to use its photo. What if it was a crazy fan who was involved in Eric's murder? This would probably explain why the toy was missing. With this in mind, I came back home and went to bed. The next day, when I entered the coffee shop, I was struck by what I saw. The walls were covered with copies of Eric's most recent works. Frida confessed that she had them made using the money she hadn't had the chance to repay him. It turned out that ever since he became our regular customer, she'd developed an interest in his works. She had a few magazines with his photos, and she'd even asked Eric to sign them for her. I thought it was wrong to decorate the interior with the photos without the author's permission, but I prayed it was Frida's only crime. Could she have pushed him off the balcony because of her obsession with him? Or because she didn't want to repay the debt? Though in this case, I doubted she'd spend the money on the gallery of the memories of her victim. Or she could do it, tormented by guilt. Derek passed by me and I again felt the familiar fragrance. Something had changed in him recently. His gait got more confident and he squared his shoulders. Perhaps this was the influence of the news of his upcoming fatherhood. It looked like he had spread his wings. The thought of the wings triggered the memory of Eric's body sprawled on the asphalt, with the wings on his back. What if Derek, knowing of Frida's obsession with Eric, felt jealous of him? And what if, after he murdered the photographer, he stole the perfume to be like him in his girlfriend's eyes? But why would he need the plane? I locked myself in the cloakroom and began checking my colleagues' bags. First, I searched Derek's backpack and found his passport. My glance skimmed his name and date of birth until it fell on the place of his birth. It was incredible, but he was born in the same European town where the Dupays had adopted Eric. Frida's handbag was no less surprising. In it, I found the wooden plane. I felt fury building up in me. I craved the public confession. I returned to the coffee shop's main area, jumped on a table, and put my hands up, holding the wooden plane in one hand and a lighter in the other, and I called Frida and Derek. The customers, anticipating viral content, turned on cameras on their phones. I think I looked insane because Frida grabbed her phone and called an ambulance. Derek started advancing on me ferociously, demanding to give back the plane. I flicked the lighter's cap open and brought the fire to the toy. Fear flashed in his eyes. His lips trembled as if he were a child deprived of the most desired thing in the world. And then he spoke. He told me how he'd hated Eric all his life, Because he'd killed their mother while she was delivering him. Because he'd left him, his 5-year-old big brother, alone in the orphanage. Because he'd taken Derek's plane while he was leaving for his new life with his new parents. Because he'd never tried to find him as an adult. And he, Derek, found him by accident when he'd seen the interview with the photo of the plane. After that, he moved here to find his brother and found a job at the coffee shop he attended. Once, he even found the courage to talk to him. But Eric waved him off like an annoying fan. Derek hated him. For his success, his money, and his popularity among women. For Frida's admiration of him. He was jealous of her and suspected she was cheating on him. The night before the tragedy, he saw Eric taking his girlfriend home with him. It was dark, and so Derek took me for Frida. He spent all night watching, and when I went to get the coffee, he ran to the apartment. I hadn't locked the door, so he entered easily. He grabbed his sleepy brother, took him to the balcony, and threw him down from the 15th floor. Afterward, he cleaned up the mess, wiped out his fingerprints, and ran away before the police arrived. Derek begged me not to burn the plane because he'd already prepared it as a gift for his future son. By the time he finished his confession, the police and medics had arrived at the coffee shop. I gave the plane to Frida. If her baby were born, it would be the only thing he would have left from his father. I sincerely hope the boy won't repeat his father's fate. I hope the motherly love will protect him from hatred, jealousy, and cruelty. This is so little, but at the same time so much, to grow up happy and capable of love and forgiveness.